Welcome, everybody. It's great. Looks like we have 100 people. Yeah, as Ingrid said, my name is Keith Knapp. I'm the director of the Iowa LTAP. In fact, maybe I should share. I'm watching the chat, which I probably should. I should probably turn that off because I'm going to talk about focusing and being in the moment. So I think I actually will, and I'll let Ingrid look at that. But I love what you're putting in there about responding. I said reducing stress. It kind of does both, right? If we have the right response processes. But let me share just my title sheet here. Oop, share sound. Okay, I think that should be working there. If everything's on board.
Yes, we
Uh,
can see it.
okay, thank you. And I'm going to be looking over here every once in a while because that's where my screen is. And it's something that, oops, sorry, making sure my timer's still on. And so really what we're talking about here today is responding to stress, which is different than reacting to stress, even different than reducing stress. Sorry, I'm kind of playing around with some Zoom stuff. I don't do a lot of Zoom, so I'm learning about Zoom. I use other kind of documents, other like softwares and things like that. But in my practice, I do sometimes use Zoom at home. So responding to stress, one strategy, a bit of mindfulness is the way I put it. Um, you'll see that again, the way I approach this kind of thing. So I'm a PE, I'm an engineer. I'm also a certified mindfulness meditation teacher. That's happened. It was a 2-year program. I've been doing this kind of thing for almost a decade. So you can see the little dots after my PE and after the director, because those are, and there, I don't know if you've heard the little beep there. That's one of the slides that's coming up. Every 10 minutes, you might hear a slight beep. And if you notice that I stop and take a couple of breaths, this is something that I do regularly at work. I basically have a timer in the background that's on YouTube, 10-minute timer interval, and just a slight beep comes out of my computer. I stop. Maybe for 3 breaths. 3 breaths can take a long time when you're really busy. And this morning has been very stressful. I've been here since about 5:30 or 6 o'clock this morning, doing a number of things that needed to get done very quickly. That little beep helps me. So that's why you see the dot, 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 though, after my name, after my labels. These are all labels. One of the important things often, and you'll see that I kind of wind through some of this. We might get to all these slides, we might not. One of the things that's really important, like for happiness at work, things in the documents, right? I'm a researcher too, so is that that separation, right? How you define yourself, how you're comfortable with yourself. That work is not, some people define themselves by work, but there's a whole nother world out there, right? So I am a PE, but it is not who I am, right? I am the director, but it is not who I am. There's so much more to me that most people don't know that I'm very comfortable with. So moving on. Yes, this is that little pun at the top was on purpose. The word intention is important here. You can have objectives and goals. If you go into meditation, and we will do a little bit of mindfulness meditation, one tool, but you don't have to have a formal meditation process to be mindful. And so intention is important in a lot of what I do, a lot about what we do, rather than uh, objectives, which is how most of our life is built. Goals and objectives. If you sit down and you have a goal or objective, if you're sitting down in meditation and you have a goal or an objective, you're probably not going to make it. Meaning the whole point is just sitting, just being in the present moment. When we talk about focusing on our breath, it's about being here now, nowhere else, right? Our mind thinks, always will. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why we have it. And it's a matter of watching that and being aware of it. It's about awareness. So there's awareness, concentration, awareness brings wisdom. Anyway, our intentions today, my intentions is to help you understand stress a bit more, kind of its origins and impacts. I got a couple of videos that add up to about 20 minutes. We'll talk about our relationship with stress because it turns out mindset and how we approach stress is important because not all stress is bad, right? We talked about running. I got to get myself pumped up to do my 4 miles. And, if I don't, so that's getting me, that's getting my chemicals going. So I get out there and do it, gets work done, that kind of thing. And then just some mindfulness response strategies, things I do at work, things I do at home, things that come out of books, that kind of thing. Acknowledgements from some of the slide material, because the great thing about being in the, if you will, the mindfulness meditation world is that people share stuff all the time. And so Tony Loomer out of Idaho DOT from a few years back, Donna Shea, Connecticut LTAP, and a number of others that have shared materials with me, along with how I've changed it and adjusted to it. Two things I want to kind of bring up before I forget. So there's lots of ways of reducing stress or dealing with stress. Physical lifestyle, activity lifestyle, we talked about, mental mindfulness, emotional well-being stuff. Social support, connection, huge, right? Being with people, being around people, helping people, caring for people. And you'll see that coming up here too. And then, of course, what you can get over and over and over again, a lot of is time management, organization, distributing work, all that. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to be in the kind of well-being area, if you will. So first, though, if you're willing and able and want to, uh, I always do a arriving and settling practice. It's going to be a few minutes. If you've done this kind of thing, it's just sitting, focusing on your breath. So if just go ahead with this as a practice, as present moment awareness. So if you can kind of finding a comfortable position in your chair, wherever you happen to be, close your eyes if you can, soften your gaze if that's better for you and more comfortable. And then just scan your body a little bit, see if there's any places of tension. Let that go if you can. If not, it's okay. Feel your seat in your chair, feet on the floor. And the body knows straight back, soft front, strong back, soft belly. Your body knows when something's important. Sitting upright and focusing on your breath wherever you might feel it. Could be your chest, your belly, your nose, upper lip, throat. Just track that breath in and out. And if it helps, you can count them. Remembering that even the best of the best meditators often don't get past 3. And if your mind wanders, future, past, it's okay. That's what minds do. They think. The awareness of coming back to the breath is what's important here. Do it nicely, like you're training a little puppy. Hey, welcome back. You're back. You're back in the chair. You're back here and now. If it helps, take a few deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. Settle in and let gravity just pull you right into that chair. That door you came through, you're just here right now. You know you're breathing in and breathing out. Again, if the mind wanders, just bring it back best you can. Just be with what is here. Okay. Coming back to where we are here, opening the eyes when you're ready. And if you can feel that, maybe, often when we rest, we stop. There's an idea of going slower to get stuff done faster, just stopping. The story I always tell is I do a lot of conferences. And I remember very distinctly the first time we're in that frenzy, right? Planning. People are coming at you from every direction. And I remember very distinctly the first time I started listening and being there for people, but focusing on my breath and my belly. Bringing myself back to that location so you're there for that person. And I'm thinking you all know, well, you know when someone's listening to you and when they're there, right? Really listening to you. And that's really important. Listening is a good thing. Okay. Setting a reminder is another thing you do. I do. I thought I'd mention it. I want to make sure my thing's still going here. My timer in the background. So in about 50 seconds, there's going to be another little ding that I hope you can hear. About 40 seconds now, that I do again at work in the background. I could be talking to someone, and I can hear that and move on. So that's just another little practice. You can be mindful without having a formal practice doing what we just did. So what's the purpose of stress? Come on, there we go. Well, long ago, yeah, we used it, and stress is what we do to like stay alive, right? It's there. It's the oldest part of our brain. I don't know that we can outrun a tornado. I'm not sure why we put that photograph in there, or a bear or a lion for that matter, but that's you get the point, right? So my understanding of all this is we have kind of three parts. There you go. I don't know if you heard that or not. If you did, you can tell me. That'll be the last time I bring that up. But if I do happen to hear it, you'll
Yes,
probably.
it was very faint, but we did hear a little ding.
Okay. And you'll see me stop for a few seconds, remind myself. I'm sure you have gone through processes where you're like, geez, I don't know what just happened to the last hour, right? And so this tends to help bring you back to the room, to what's going on with your body and mind. So back to the uh, presentation. So 20, 25 minutes. So that's that basic survival, flight or fright kind of stuff. Fight or flight, sorry. Then the limbic comes into it 50 million years later, approximately, and that's where our emotions start coming into all this. And the cortex, the newest part of our brain, where all the rational, logical thinking is happening. So we have this stimulus that happens, these chemicals go, we get epinephrine, cortisol, all that, and often that kicks in and we react versus respond. And all of what we do with mindfulness and whatnot has to do with kind of, seeing that pattern in your body. I know when my jaw starts tightening, my shoulders start tightening. I can feel that while I'm at work and then go, oh, shoot, yeah, that's a sign, right? For me. For others, it'll be different. Point is everybody's got a combination of things they do to help out with stress. So I'm going to play this video here. It's about 6 minutes long about some research that's going on. I'm forgetting his name right now. I apologize. They say it in the video.
All of us have a personal relationship with stress, but few of us know how it operates within us, or understand how the onslaught of the modern world can stress us to the point of death. Fewer still know what we can do about it.
Whoops, sorry. Looks like it stopped.
But over the last 3 decades, Stanford University neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky has been advancing our understanding of stress, how it impacts our bodies, and how our social standing can make us more or less susceptible.
Is the aggregate bad news and
most of the time, you can find him teaching and researching in the high-achieving, high-stressed world of brain science.
paper is this huge contrast between class.
But that's only part of his story. For a few weeks every year or so, Sapolsky shifts his lab to a place more than 9,000 miles away on the plains of the Masai Mara Reserve in Kenya, East Africa. Robert Sapolsky first came to Africa over 30 years ago on a hunch. He suspected he could find out more about human stress and disease by looking at non-humans. And he knew just the non-humans.
You live in a place like this, you're a baboon, and you only have to spend about 3 hours a day getting your calories. And if you only have to work 3 hours a day, you got 9 hours of free time every day to devote to making somebody else just miserable. They're not being stressed by lions chasing them all the time. They're being stressed by each other. They're being stressed by social and psychological tumult invented by their own species. They're a perfect model for westernized stress-related disease.
To determine just what toll stress was taking on their bodies, Sapolsky wanted to look inside these wild baboons at the cellular level for the very first time. To do this, he would have to take their blood in the most unassuming way.
Sorry about that.
Basically, what you're trying to do is anesthetize a baboon without him knowing it's coming. Because you don't want to have any of this anticipatory stress, so you can't just, get in your Jeep and chase the baboon up and down the field for 3 hours, and finally, when he's winded, dart him with an anesthetic. The big advantages of a blowgun are that it's pretty much silent, and it hasn't a whole lot in the way of moving parts, but the big drawback is it doesn't go very far. So what you spend just a bizarre amount of time doing is trying to figure out how to look nonchalant around a baboon. Got him? Time. Okay, he is wobbling now. Okay, whoop, here he goes.
From each baboon blood sample, Robert measured levels of hormones central to the stress response.
Well, to make sense of what's happening in your body, you've got these two hormones that are the workhorses of the whole stress response. One of them, we all know, adrenaline, American version, epinephrine. The other is a less known hormone called glucocorticoids. It comes out of the adrenal gland along with adrenaline. And these are the two backbones of the stress response.
That stress response and those two hormones are critical to our survival.
Because what stress is about is somebody is very intent on eating you, or you are very intent on eating somebody, and there's an immediate crisis going on.
When you run for your life, basics are all that matter. Lungs work overtime to pump mammoth quantities of oxygen into the bloodstream. The heart races to pump that oxygen throughout the body, so muscles respond instantly.
You need your blood pressure up to deliver that energy. You need to turn off anything that's not essential. Growth, reproduction, you're running for your life. This is no time to ovulate. Tissue repair, all that sort of thing. Do it later if there is a later.
When the zebra escapes, its stress response shuts down. But human beings can't seem to find their off switch.
We turn on the exact same stress response for purely psychological states, thinking about the ozone layer, the taxes coming up, mortality, 30-year mortgages. We turn on the same stress response, and the key difference there is we're not doing it for a real physiological reason, and we're doing it nonstop.
By not turning off the stress response when reacting to life's traffic jams, we wallow in a corrosive bath of hormones. Even though it's not life or death, we hyperventilate, our hearts pound, muscles tense.
Ironically, after a while, the stress response is more damaging than the stressor itself, because the stressor is some psychological nonsense that you're falling for. No zebra on Earth running for its life would understand why fear of speaking in public would cause you to secrete the same hormones that it's doing at that point to save its life.
Okay. Sorry about people that couldn't hear that. These are all online. They're all on the YouTube, National Geographic. We can share the connections links for that. And there's some new ones too, of course. I find it interesting, again, this guy talks about, if you saw the zebras running, mama was protecting its little baby there from that lion, if you didn't notice that. I mean, so things overwhelm, right? Um, and that he says they're a perfect example of Western society. And, he actually wrote a book, I think it's called something like Zebras Don't Get Ulcers or something like that. So, there, it started over. So what we're doing, of course, now is this, right? But we just can't tell. So we've got this picture of this guy looking in the mirror thinking, why am I not young again? And so there's worrying about the past and the future, the ruminating about the past and all over. Um, Okay, thank you. I was just looking at the chat there. And then we got sports events and too much to do at work. The to-do list just keeps getting longer. I know that one. Kids, traffic, sports, lots of things going on, right? And unfortunately, our bodies, unless we relate to that, can't tell a difference. And so the same stuff keeps getting pumped into us. And so we have our lives, right? Our to-do lists. How's your to-do list? Feeling short of time, right? And this can get chronic, right? We have this attention economy. That's just one theory about all these distractions. Everybody wants my attention and there's just not enough of it. And we have to deal with that. And there's this deficit that goes on. And our typical solution tends to be, I'm just going to do all kinds of things all at the same time and call it multitasking. But those of us that know better know that this is not even neurologically possible, even though it may feel like it is because we're zooming back and forth between tasks very quickly. So the other thing to remember before I forget this one too is, besides a combination of things we do to kind of respond to stress, is that we are also neurologically plastic. Neuroplasticity says, despite what some history has shown, that we can change our brain structures and connections throughout our lives, all the way up to old age. We can start new habits, change different connections, fire our neurons differently through intention and habit. That's been shown now that that is true. And I think just physically, we also know that when we kind of think about it, that we can change. It used to be, oh, you had to be in elementary school or nothing would change. It just shows that each shift takes time and energy. When we're trying to multitask, one thing at a time gets done faster. And the research shows when we try to multitask, we're less creative, less effective. We make more mistakes, and it can be addictive. I say think email because I know that's how I am. I get into email, and then I all of a sudden an hour has passed, and I don't know what happened to it. So mindfulness is one resource to reframe, is the way I put it. Just one of many things that you might want to try, and to reframe our interaction with our mind and with stress, if you will, our emotions. So stress comes through, of course, in how our body feels, how our mind feels, in the relationship between the mind body, and recognizing that, being aware of that as we can. Some people might call it emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of having that awareness. That's that key thing is having the awareness, because often when we are going off and doing our thing and don't know what's happened to time or whatever, that we're not even kind of aware of what we're doing. So all sounds very easy. It's not, but not all stress is bad. Like I said, running, roller coasters, all this great thing. If it's moderate and comes and goes, and we have resources to deal with it, whatever they happen to be, whatever combination, then it can actually serve a purpose, right? But if it's high intensity and chronic and we don't have the resources or choose not to take advantage of them, that can be a little different situation. But again, if we have resources, we can deal with stuff that happens a lot. I was at home this weekend. My father's elderly. We're taking care of them. Caregivers, right, have to resource themselves on a regular basis, because, as they say, you can't take care of someone else if you're not taking care of yourself. So I did want to show this video. I don't know if I'll show the whole thing. It's about 14 minutes long. It's a great video. So those that can't hear, I apologize, but it's Kelly McGonigal is a social psychologist that does things in the reframing of stress. And she did a TED Talk about 10 years ago. If you can't hear, let me know. Anybody new? I'm sorry, each time I click on my mute button, sorry, it turns off the video.
I have a confession to make. But first, I want you to make a little confession to me. In the past year, I want you to just raise your hand if you've experienced relatively little stress. Anyone? Mm-hmm. How about a moderate amount of stress? Who's experienced a lot of stress? Yeah, me too. But that is not my confession. My confession is this. I am a health psychologist, and my mission is to help people be happier and healthier. But I fear that something I've been teaching for the last 10 years is doing more harm than good, and it has to do with stress. For years, I've been telling people stress makes you sick. It increases the risk of everything from the common cold to cardiovascular disease. Basically, I've turned stress into the enemy. But I've changed my mind about stress. And today, I want to change yours. Let me start with the study that made me rethink my whole approach to stress. This study tracked 30,000 adults in the United States for 8 years. And they started by asking people, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, do you believe that stress is harmful for your health? And then they used public death records to find out who died. Okay, some bad news first. People who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who also believed that stress is harmful for your health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not view stress as harmful were no more likely to die. In fact, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, including people who had relatively little stress. Now, the researchers estimated that over the 8 years they were tracking deaths, 182,000 Americans died prematurely, not from stress, but from the belief that stress is bad for you. That is over 20,000 deaths a year. Now, if that estimate is correct, that would make believing stress is bad for you the 15th largest cause of death in the United States last year, killing more people than skin cancer, HIV, AIDS, and homicide. You can see why this study freaked me out. Here I've been spending so much energy telling people stress is bad for your health. So this study got me wondering, can changing how you think about stress make you healthier? And here the science says yes. When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress. Now, to explain how this works, I want you all to pretend that you are participants in a study designed to stress you out. It's called the social stress test. You come into the laboratory and you're told you have to give a 5-minute impromptu speech on your personal weaknesses to a panel of expert evaluators sitting right in front of you. And to make sure you feel the pressure, there are bright lights and a camera in your face, kind of like this. And the evaluators have been trained to give you discouraging nonverbal feedback, like this. Now that you're sufficiently demoralized, time for part 2, a math test. And unbeknownst to you, the experimenter has been trained to harass you during it. Now, we're gonna all do this together. It's gonna be fun, for me. Okay. I want you all to count backwards from 996 in increments of 7. You're gonna do this out loud as fast as you can, starting with 996. Go. Go faster. Faster, please. You're going too slow. Stop, 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 stop. That guy made a mistake. We're gonna have to start all over again. You're not very good at this, are you? Okay, so you get the idea. Now, if you were actually in this study, you'd probably be a little stressed out. Your heart might be pounding, you might be breathing faster, maybe breaking out into a sweat. And normally we interpret these physical changes as anxiety or signs that we aren't coping very well with the pressure. But what if you viewed them instead as signs that your body was energized, was preparing you to meet this challenge? Now, that is exactly what participants were told in a study conducted at Harvard University. Before they went through the social stress test, they were taught to rethink their stress response as helpful. That pounding heart is preparing you for action. If you're breathing faster, it's no problem. It's getting more oxygen to your brain. And participants who learned to view the stress response as helpful for their performance, well, they were less stressed out, less anxious, more confident. But the most fascinating finding to me was how their physical stress response changed. Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict like this. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress is sometimes associated with cardiovascular disease. It's not really healthy to be in this state all the time. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile. It actually looks a lot like what happens in moments of joy and courage. Over a lifetime of stressful experiences, this one biological change could be the difference between a stress-induced heart attack at age 50 and living well into your 90s. And this is really what the new science of stress reveals, that how you think about stress matters. So my goal as a health psychologist has changed. I no longer want to get rid of your stress. I want to make you better at stress. And we just did a little intervention. If you raised your hand and said you'd had a lot of stress in the last year, we could have saved your life. Because hopefully the next time your heart is pounding from stress, you're going to remember this talk. And you're going to think to yourself, this is my body helping me rise to this challenge. And when you view stress in that way, your body believes you and your stress response becomes healthier. Now, I said I have over a decade of demonizing stress to redeem myself from. So we are going to do one more intervention. I want to tell you about one of the most underappreciated aspects of the stress response. And the idea is this: stress makes you social. To understand this side of stress, we need to talk about a hormone, oxytocin. And I know oxytocin has already gotten as much hype as a hormone can get. It even has its own cute nickname, the cuddle hormone, because it's released when you hug someone. But this is a very small part of what oxytocin is involved in. Oxytocin is a neurohormone. It fine-tunes your brain's social instincts. It primes you to do things that strengthen close relationships. Oxytocin makes you crave physical contact with your friends and family. It enhances your empathy. It even makes you more willing to help and support the people you care about. Some people have even suggested we should snort oxytocin to become more compassionate and caring. But here's what most people don't understand about oxytocin. It's a stress hormone. Your pituitary gland pumps this stuff out as part of the stress response. It's as much a part of your stress response as the adrenaline that makes your heart pound. And when oxytocin is released in the stress response, it is motivating you to seek support. Your biological stress response is nudging you to tell someone how you feel instead of bottling it up. Your stress response wants to make sure you notice when someone else in your life is struggling so that you can support each other. When life is difficult, your stress response wants you to be surrounded by people who care about you. Okay, so how is knowing this side of stress going to make you healthier? Well, oxytocin doesn't only act on your brain, it also acts on your body. And one of its main roles in your body is to protect your cardiovascular system from the effects of stress. It's a natural anti-inflammatory. It also helps your blood vessels stay relaxed during stress. But my favorite effect on the body is actually on the heart. Your heart has receptors for this hormone. And oxytocin helps heart cells regenerate and heal from any stress-induced damage. This stress hormone strengthens your heart. And the cool thing is that all of these physical benefits of oxytocin are enhanced by social contact and social support. So when you reach out to others under stress, either to seek support or to help someone else, you release more of this hormone, your stress response becomes healthier, and you actually recover faster from stress. I find this amazing that your stress response has a built-in mechanism for stress resilience. And that mechanism is human connection. I want to finish by telling you about one more study. And listen up, because this study could also save a life. This study tracked about 1,000 adults in the United States, and they ranged in age from 34 to 93. And they started the study by asking, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, how much time have you spent helping out friends, neighbors, people in your community? And then they used public records for the next 5 years to find out who died. Okay, so the bad news first. For every major stressful life experience, like financial difficulties or family crisis, that increased the risk of dying by 30%. But, and I hope you are expecting a but by now, but that wasn't true for everyone. People who spent time caring for others showed absolutely no stress-related increase in dying, 0. Caring created resilience. And so we see once again that the harmful effects of stress on your health are not inevitable. How you think and how you act can transform your experience of stress. When you choose to view your stress response as helpful, you create the biology of courage. And when you choose to connect with others under stress, you can create resilience. Now, I wouldn't necessarily ask for more stressful experiences in my life, but this science has given me a whole new appreciation for stress. Stress gives us access to our hearts. The compassionate heart that finds joy and meaning in connecting with others. And yes, your pounding physical heart working so hard to give you strength and energy. And when you choose to view stress in this way, you're not just getting better at stress, you're actually making a pretty profound statement. You're saying that you can trust yourself to handle life's challenges. And you're remembering that you don't have to face them alone. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, this is kind of amazing what you're telling us. It seems amazing to me that a belief about stress can make so much difference to someone's life expectancy. How would that extend to advice? Like if someone's making a lifestyle choice between, say, a stressful job and a non-stressful job, does it matter that which way they go, that it's equally wise to go for the stressful job so long as you believe that you can handle it in some sense?
Yeah, and one thing we know for certain is that chasing meaning is better for your health than trying to avoid discomfort. And so I would say that's really the best way to make decisions, is go after what it is that creates meaning in your life, and then trust yourself to handle the stress that follows.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you.
Okay, so I didn't know if I was going to play that whole thing, but every time I watch it, something new comes out at me. Mindset matters. Know your body, how things impact your body, become aware of your body. A lot of this, again, mindfulness is connected throughout all this things that helps you do it. Helps with resilience, how you view things, mindset. What else did she say at the very end? I love that, where she says, yeah, seek meaning and deal with the discomfort. Resourcing, extremely important. She talked about hugging, releasing a chemical. There's actually a hugging meditation that people do. My hugs have changed since I got into mindfulness. They're big. And that caring, community, compassion, right? And there's intent there. I mentioned habits, and we can lead ourselves to, all the stuff that's going on right now. There's a reason right now that although there's lots of stress stuff going on at universities right now, I'm thinking of opportunities. This is a change in my mindset from 10 years ago. So what the research says, though, your positive effect, dealing with things in a positive way, uh, helps with resilience. If you have a positive affect, your burnout's likely to be less. And of course, if you're resilient, burnout is also less likely too. And of course, social support and happiness are positively connected. All the things that we probably already know, and sometimes we just forget. So one resource to do something to help to resource a bit, I don't know how else to put it, is mindfulness. I was going to do this. Maybe if people real quickly, when I say the word mindfulness, what comes to mind? If you want to shoot that into the chat, I'll give you a few seconds or whatnot, because the mindfulness is used kind of all over right now. Hey, be mindful of Joe. He's got a broken leg. We hear that a lot. We're talking about it in a little different way, but they're connected clearly. It's about being there, being with what is, right? Yeah, I can meditate if I can be mindful when I'm running, right? I'm just there when I'm running, that kind of thing. Awareness, intentionality, awareness of others, yourself and others. Yep, yep. And some people mention knitting and things like that. These are all meditations, right? They're all being where you are. Prayer and meditation, they're centering prayer and things like that. So yeah, listening to the body, taking steps. Yeah, yeah, all good stuff, so we're doing a lot of this already, it sounds like. Maybe we haven't labeled what we think, but nature, absolutely. There's all kinds of proof of the benefits of nature and what it feeds us. So here's one definition: mindfulness being the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose. You're making an intent. You're doing something on purpose in the present moment and doing it non-judgmentally. This is what's happening. So she mentioned, that mindset, anxiety and my heart rate and all this. This is telling me something. Either I'm going to try to let it go or I'm going to use it in a manner to speak. If that makes sense to y'all, that again, that mindset, it really does matter. Deliberately paying full attention to what is happening around you, within you, without criticism or judgment. It is interesting as you do some of this that you kind of go, oh, so yeah, that's what that's telling me. I'm angry in this case, but it's really not anger. When I look closely, it's something else, right? That kind of thing. Art of Conscious Living, right? Short, Kabat-Zinn. This all sounds really simple, by the way. In fact, research is research, right? And then there's real life. All sounds simple, but it's not easy. Difficult to kind of put this in a box with regard to mindfulness. The whole definition thing throws me a bit because it is very much experiential. Experiential, is that the word, how you say that word? It's something you experience, something that you try and try again. I don't like to use the word failure. I try, oh, that didn't work so well. And you have to be compassionate with yourself and move on, do it. And I do it every day, right? I have a formal practice. So sometimes it's like, oh, kind of went okay. I wonder what that all means. And I move on, right? So you don't bash yourself up because you want that goal, you want something, right? I want to have stress reduction and I didn't get it. So you're focusing on stress while you're meditating and you're actually increasing your stress, or you're trying to be mindful and it's not working. And so your stress levels go up. You got to let that go, right? And just kind of go, it's not about the end result, but it's about being present. So lots of benefits. There's lots of research out there, some better than others. You see some of them here about reduced stress and improved awareness. Again, and if you want to ask questions, please do. Self-esteem, empathy. Again, it depends on what you're focusing on, because there's meditations, which is one tool of mindfulness. And then so that's the formal part, which again, I have on a regular basis. And then there's informal mindfulness and being present in that manner, or some kind of combination of those two. A lot of the research is done on people that do real serious meditation to show how things change. And there's a lot of people doing this kind of research now. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes is do another practice similar to what we did previously, just a bit longer, just breathing. So if people want to kind of settle in again, feel their body in the chair where you happen to be sitting, close your eyes if you're comfortable with that. And once again, focus in on the body, scan through it a bit, see whether it feels different now than it did 30, 40 minutes ago. Breathe into those places of tension if you're able. Let it go or just be with that and focus in on your breath here, wherever you feel it the most. Maybe take a deep breath in through the nose, then out through the mouth. Just be right here. Nowhere to go, really. Just right here. Right, notice that there's a gap between your in-breath and your out-breath. Don't manipulate, just regular rhythm. You find yourself thinking about this or that, wandering, distracted. It's all good. Pull yourself back. Your breath is your anchor in this case. And if the breath is tough for you as an anchor, see if you can feel the inside of your hands and the sense that they bring. Hands tend to have very little trauma connected to them, so they're a good thing to focus on sometimes. The breath can't be anywhere but right in the present moment. It's always with you, and it's free. So again, just short, coming back as you're able. This is something, again, as I mentioned, that I just short little snippets on this. There's other short moments, many times kind of approaches. There's a book called How to Train a Wild Elephant from Jan Chozan Bays out of San Francisco. Daily things. There's 53 chapters. Tiny little book. Well, I've got it here somewhere. Hold on. There it is. Right here. Um, and just 3 breaths is one. Stop once in a while. Take 3 breaths. Appreciate your hands and all the things they do. Every time a phone rings, pause, take a breath, then pick up. I say email, that little bell. Wow. If you've ever been walking through nature and you forget to turn your phone off and the bell goes off, watch your body. Mine goes like this, like I want to grab it and I have to physically not do it. So that's why I silence my phone when I'm walking out there. Every time you see the color blue, taking a pause. She's got much more detail on these and 53 of them. Smile, look in the mirror every once in a while, smile. Smiles do things, right? It changes your chemistry. So it's a good thing. So I'm not recommending the book or not. I like it because it's about doing things kind of day to day and being there. I call these stealth mindfulness approaches. And I want to leave some time for some questions here, but before our conversation, have an intention. Intention's always important. What do you want to see happen here? I want to be there for this person. The best gift you can give someone is to be there for them and nowhere else. Easier said than done, right? On a call, maybe just do one thing. If you're kind of going through something, mentally acknowledge everybody that's helped you. Be gratitude. We'll try to do a little bit of gratitude practice here because that, again, it changes your body chemistry and it's all about becoming familiar with all of this. Read an email twice before responding. Don't react, respond, right? Listen more, speak less. I have a little thing above my door over here that basically says, wait, why am I talking? Sometimes I forget to look at it, but nonetheless. Um, Feeling down, consider helping someone at work. Use doorways as an interspace. You walk through the door, you're there. You change it, you touch the doorknob, you're there. And explore that box. The boxes, we have a very definite kind of idea of who we are and what we do and how we work. I say explore that box, not just about inside or outside, but explore that box. That comes from Real Happiness at Work. Sharon Salzberg, international expert in loving kindness meditation. She's pretty great. So I'll do one last practice if we want. We could for just 2 minutes, and it's about gratitude. So hopefully, again, we leave or lean into joy after we're done here. So once again, settling into your chair, focusing on that breath a little bit. Taking a couple of deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. And maybe bring up, visualize something you have gratitude for. Person, place, a thing. How about a person you're grateful for? Visualize that person. Why you're grateful for that person. Doesn't have to be big. Again, it could also be something small. I had a great orange this morning. Doesn't have to be small. I woke up. I'm breathing. The sky is blue. Gratitude is an intention, a habit that can be built. You can practice it. For many months, I did 3 small gratitudes every morning. You can journal it, you can say it verbally, maybe do it in community with someone. When you think about that person or the blue sky, see if it changes your body. What do you feel for this person you're thankful for that they're in your life? This dog, this pet. Tree out back. Thank you. Thank you for being in my life. Thank you all that we're all here, all together, all sitting together. Love it. When you're ready and come back, I apologize for that being so short. I would have loved to done that for 10 or 15 minutes. Uh, Gratitude practices. I did them during COVID. I do them with my family remotely through texts. Try to do it every day. And when I think people need it, I kind of shoot them out that thing and see if I can start another rolling pattern from day to day. Things I do. I have a morning intention that's stuck to my mirror when I walk into the bathroom that says, waking up this morning, I smile knowing there are 24 brand new hours before me. I vow to live fully in the moment and look at beings with eyes of compassion. Sometimes I see it. Sometimes I don't. But it is there. And I have a daily formal and the informal stuff, like I mentioned, these interval bells that I do, the weight sticker I mentioned, the gratitude practice, and of course, I exercise too. Last but not least, we do this, and it's hardest, as I say down at the bottom, hardest to do when it's most needed, right? When we're most busy. When I am doing a conference and I'm 3 or 4 days into that thing, I should be getting up earlier and kind of 10 minutes, right? Or remembering that throughout the day. Putting the day to bed is something that you can do journaling or visually, verbally. Today's achievements. What did I achieve today? What are tomorrow's kind of goals or things that might happen? And then just let it go. There's time for sleep and there's time for think. Again, I wake up in the middle of the night too, and I have to remind myself that's compartmentalization, right? There's work and then there's this and then there's that. This is my time. Self-care is so important for everybody around you, and it feeds around you. And then they talk about a positivity score and kind of the happy thought for the day, and then you go. You let the day go, right? Put it to bed. I don't know that I have a lot of final thoughts, except that I think it's been helpful for me. I think people have noticed it over the decade or more that I've been doing this. I do regular things again in my own Zoom. If people are interested in that. I don't want this to be a sales pitch, but it's not really a sales one. It's free, right? But I do this. I'm always happy to talk mindfulness. So thanks everybody. If anybody's got any questions, that kind of thing, there's so much more to talk about. I could go for hours on this.
Hey, thank you so much, Keith. For those of you who are still in the room, I did put the SurveyMonkey link in the chat. I can put it in the chat again as well. If you fill that out, you can give us some feedback about maybe other things that you would want to see in the future, as well as that's how you'll get your certificate of attendance for today's session. I'm going to stop recording.